It is 100 degrees in this room. I'm wearing a sweater for the aesthetic of it. My dog is wandering around. So this is how we're starting things out. Hi, my name is Catherine, and this is my new booktube channel. I'm here to talk about books, as one does on a booktube channel. Slight change of angle, sorry. But I wanted to start off this month by doing an August recap, like a wrap up, because I loved so many of the books I read in August, and I was sitting here and I was like, I want to talk about the books I read in August, but I don't have anyone to talk about them with. And I was like, I'm going to film this YouTube video that I've been meaning to film for a really long time, because I've been wanting to do a booktube channel for a really long time, and we're finally getting around to doing it. So I have my little list, so because I'm filming on my phone right now, so I can't look at Goodreads, so I like horribly wrote down all the books I read in the month of August. I read 15 books, which is really good. Most of my reading is done through audiobook. I have a job where I can sit there with headphones in the entire time, so I listen to audiobooks. I do own physical copies of 6 of the books I'll talk about today, so that's pretty good. And for the past couple months, I've been doing themed reading months for myself as a way to kind of guide my reading. June, I did LGBT-centric literature, and July and also in August started out as me getting caught up on series that I mean to get caught up on for a really long time. And then it turned into me starting series I've been meaning to start for a really long time, and me reading standalones that I've been meaning to read for a really long time. So kind of me reaching back into my TBR, looking at stuff that I've been wanting to read for the past year or so, but just kind of getting around to stuff that I wanted to get around to for a really long time. So that's why I've done it for 2 months, because I have a lot I want to read that I've been meaning to read for a really long time, and it's mostly fantasy. I have one book that's like horror-esque, so not like straight fantasy, but nothing is like contemporary young adult romance kind of stuff. For me, in terms of my reading preference is fantasy, whether it be young adult or adult, new adult. Is there new adult fantasy? I feel like most of it's like new adult canoodling time. But anyway, so I'm going to start off with the beginning of the month. The first book I read this month wasn't a part of my theme, because I was reading it before I decided that I wanted to kind of continue on doing themed readings for the month. But the first book I read was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. She narrates her audiobooks. I read her second book in June, With the Fire on High, which was fantastic. I gave it 5 out of 5. I loved it. This book I gave a 4 out of 5. It's a story told in verse about this young girl and her twin brother living in New York City. She has an incredibly religious mother, and about her just kind of struggling with that. There's a potential romance, and I liked it. I just feel like my constant issue with stories in verse is that I just want more from them, and more story and plot and kind of stuff like that, which you don't tend to find with stories told in verse. So that's why I docked it a star, but it was a fun read. I enjoyed it. I did feel like the ending wrapped up a little too quickly, and it wasn't like everything was perfect, but everything was like pretty perfect, and I was kind of left a little bit unsatisfied with the ending, but is what it is. The next book I read in June was Warcross by Marissa. I listened to this on Scribd, which I have beef with Scribd now because it doesn't work, but I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5. It is a near future story about, it's very like Ready Player One-esque. I'm pretty sure everyone knows what Warcross is about. It's like this game, and this girl's a hacker, and she like hacks into the game, and then she's like recruited by the people who like made the game to like catch this other hacker. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the technology aspects of it. I enjoyed the team dynamics, because she like ends up joining this game in a team, and I loved that aspect. I loved like the hacking stuff. The one thing I didn't love was the romance, which is why the next book I read was Wildcard. I actually read it a little bit later in the month, but I'll talk about them together. I read Wildcard, and I give that one 3 out of 5, which, if I didn't like the romance in the first book, and if you've read both of them, you'd understand why I really don't like the romance in the second book. I'm not going to talk about the plot, because the plot pretty much picks up right where the first book ends, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I was just I felt like there was so much filler in the second book. This was the only 3-star I read this month, I think. Yeah, I only read 1 3-star, and it was this. I read 5 4-stars and 9 5-stars. So I had a really good reading month other than this one book, and I was super upset because I really enjoyed Warcross. Like, it was a super strong 4 stars. It could have easily been a 5-star. But I just felt like the romance was super sus in the second book. And I felt like there was so much filler. We were, like, getting flashbacks for characters that we've known since the beginning of the first book. And it was kind of just like, why are we getting flashbacks about these characters that we met forever ago? I just don't care. But that was a disappointing read. Yeah. Next are Renegades by Marissa Meyer. I give this one 5 out of 5. A series I've been meaning to start for a really long time. It's like a superhero, supervillain story with the supervillain trying to, like, infiltrate the hero and, like, bring them down from the inside. It's a super fast read. It looks very big, but it's a super fast read. Everyone has, like, different superpowers that are super unique. And I really enjoyed it. I really love Marissa Meyer's writing. I think all of her books I've read, I've given 5 out of 5. I read another one of her books this month, so she's a fave. I enjoy her writing. After that, I read Scarlet, also by Marissa Meyer. Also give this a 5 out of 5. I can't talk too much about this. It's the second book in the Lunar Chronicle series. I read the first book in the Lunar Chronicle series in 2014. And even though I loved it, and I probably gave it a 5 out of 5 if I was rating books at the time, I never continued on with the story. So I was like, I'm going to read the second. And I read the second, and I loved it. I don't know if I loved it quite as much as the first one. The Lunar Chronicles, if you don't know, is like fairy tale retellings in a sci-fi futuristic setting. Super cool. I really enjoyed the first one. The first one's Cinderella. The second one was Red Riding Hood. But you get, it's like there's like a continuous plot line, but you get introduced to the fairy tale retelling main girl in each book. The next one is, the third book is Rapunzel. And the fourth one is Sleeping Beauty. So I really enjoyed that. The next book I read, I actually have a physical copy of, and that was Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. I gave this one 4 out of 5. It is a fantasy story about this girl who can speak to the gods in a world where they're trying to extinguish magic, and she has to kind of run from this young prince. It's a dual perspective novel. She has to run from this prince in order to kind of save herself, and then they decide, she like meets up with these other people, and they decide they're going to try and kill the king, who's like this horrible person. But this book was super fun. There's a lot of characters, and they have very complex names. Very Russian, Middle European, Polish kind of inspired. Tons of morally great characters. Loved the writing in this. I was super in love with the writing in this. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because the beginning is super confusing. It does kind of throw you into the middle of the action. There's a lot of long names. There's a lot of stuff going on, and you don't really know what's happening. And so I was a little bit lost and pretty confused for like the first third of this novel. But once you kind of get your groove, it's easier to understand. And I'm really excited for the second one, because obviously that problem that I had in this book, I'm not going to have in the second book, because we're already introduced to the world and the characters. I loved how the ending was handled, kind of the deviation from what you typically expect from a young adult fantasy. This is really, really good. Stick with it if you're a little confused at the beginning, because it does get better. The next book I read, I don't own a physical copy of it, but I do own the physical copy of the first one. This is The Diviners. The next book I read was Lair of Dreams, which is the second book of the Diviner series. Again, I can't talk much about it because it is the second book in the series. I gave it 5 out of 5. I'm obsessed with the Diviner series. It's like 1920s New York City with these people who have special powers, and they're like trying to like survive these like super spooky haunting things. It's so good. It's like one of my favorite series of all time, and it's so much fun. 5 out of 5 if I didn't say that. The audiobooks for the Diviner series are so fantastic. The narrator, January Lavoie, is such an incredible voice actor that you're listening to it and you forget that there's only a single narrator, because the voices she does for all the characters are so good. So if you're able to listen to the audiobook, I recommend the audiobook. The next book I read in August was Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This was one that like deviated from my theme because it came out this month and I was so excited to read this that I was like, I just need to read it. This is a Lord of the Flies-esque story about all these girls who are like trapped on this island with this tox that's like morphing their bodies and doing weird things to them, and they have to like survive, and it's super cool. I really enjoyed this. It's dual perspective, which I love, but it follows 3 girls. One of the girls goes missing, and the other 2 girls are trying to find her while also surviving this tox. Love it. A+. The writing's really good. The setting's super cool. Very spooky, scary skeletons at times, because it is kind of that horror-esque novel. And the cover's really pretty. It was a very good novel. The next 2 books I'll talk about are probably the most surprising for me, because I told myself I wasn't going to read these. I wasn't going to like them. I DNF'd the second book the first time I read it, and I was like, I'm never going to read these. And that is Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. I had DNF'd Siege and Storm in 2017. I just didn't care what was happening. I didn't care about these characters. I didn't care what was going on. And so I DNF'd it. And as part of my getting to series I've been meaning to get to for a really long time, I was really wanting to read King of Scars, which I have over here. King of Scars. I really wanted to read King of Scars. But the problem is, King of Scars follows Nikolai, who is a prominent character in the Grisha trilogy, and shows up for like a hot second in Crooked Kingdom. So I was like, I'm just going to power through these 2 books. They might suck, whatever, just so I can go on and read King of Scars. And I ended up giving both of these books 5 out of 5. I'm mad at myself because I could have loved these books if I just like got through the first like 25% of Siege and Storm. Is still kind of the same deal that I had an issue with the first one, where the main 2 characters, Mal and Elena, are kind of bland main YA characters, but I feel like they see so much development in the second book, and that development just continues on in the third book. They made me cry at work, which is always a good sign. They were so good, and I'm really excited to continue on with my reread of the Grishaverse and then get on to King of Scars, because I've been meaning to read King of Scars for a hot second. Next, the 10th book I read was a book that I had been meaning to read since 2017. It was one of my most anticipated reads of 2017, actually. And that is Daughter of the Burning City by Amanda Foody. This is a story about a girl who is like an illusionist. She can cast illusions. She's created like physical illusions that are like people that she calls her family. But she's always assumed they weren't real until one day someone starts killing them, and she has to figure out who's killing them. I really loved this book. I loved the writing. I loved the world. I loved how the magic is done. I felt like at times it felt a little bit like cliched young adult fantasy. And I did see the ending coming, which is why I docked it a star. Not necessarily because of the ending, but mostly because I did feel it was a little cliched at times, a little bit tropey YA fantasy. But I still really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that I finally got around to it. I'd started it and not like consciously DNF'd it twice, but like kind of DNF'd it twice, and I was like, I just gotta read it. And I read it, and I very much enjoyed it, and I'm glad I read it. The next book I read was Girls of Paper and Fire by Ngan. This is about this fantasy world where there's a caste system. There's moon caste, which are like demons. There's paper caste, which are humans, and steel caste, which are like a mix. It's about a girl who's part of the paper caste, and she ends up getting swept up into this thing where she has to be like a concubine to the demon king, and there's a female-female romance in it. I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 out of 5, but I felt like I wasn't as attached to the characters as I would have liked. I liked a lot of this. I just felt like at times I felt like I was just reading a standard YA fantasy, but I still enjoyed it. I enjoyed the writing. The ending dragged for me, but I enjoyed it, and I'm excited for the second one to come out because I'm really intrigued to see where it goes, because I think the ending was really interesting, and I'm excited to see how the story is continued. The next 2 books I read, I actually own both of them, are Ace of Shades by Amanda Foody, and also King of Fools by Amanda Foody. I technically finished King of Fools August 1st, but I read nearly all of it in July, so we're counting it. But this is a story about a girl whose mother goes missing, and she has to travel to this like devious city called New Rains in order to find her. Very Six of Crows-esque city. And so she ends up meeting up with this guy and his gang in order to like finagle within this city to figure out what happened with her mother. It's super cool. I love the world. I love how the magic is done, because every person has a blood talent and a split talent, and your blood talent is like your stronger talent and your split talent is your weaker talent. And you can have things that are, I think it's like called like a physical talent, where it's something essentially you could learn like dancing or arithmetic. And then there's mystery talent, mystery talents, where it's essentially like a magical power where you have a person who's able to create these, they're called like all matters, which are like a binding oath. You have people who can like create orbs, which orbs hold volts, which is like a currency. So he has like and it comes with like almost like a fire power. And so it's super interesting magic system. The world is really interesting. It is a smaller focused world, and by that I mean it's, you mostly focus on what's going on in the city. You don't see a ton of what's going on outside the city, but I don't mind, because there's so much going on that I feel like if it expanded out further it would get to be too much. And I really enjoyed these. I liked the first one more than the second one. The second one almost was a 4 out of 5, but I really loved how this ended, and I loved how Amanda Foody isn't super kind to her characters. They're always struggling with stuff. I loved the N, who is one of the main characters. I loved her development in this book. A favorite. I loved some of the characters that were introduced in the second book. So yeah. And I'm excited for the third. The third one I think should come out next year. The second one just came out. Do these have like a map in them? Ooh, there is a map. Ooh, Liberty Square has a hanging noose. That's fun. But what Amanda Foody does also that I wanted to mention is she has queer characters in all of her books. The main character in Daughter of the Burning City is bisexual. One of the main characters in this series is either bisexual or pansexual. Oh, then you have a female-female romance in this book. You also have a male-male romance or like male-male relations in these books. So really cool to have that integrated. And I feel like I don't hear people talk about that series enough for how much I loved it. I gave both of them 5 out of 5. So yep. The last book I read that I'll talk about, technically the last book I read was A King of Fools, but the last book I'm going to talk about was a reread that was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I have so much love for this series. I read this so fast. I'm listening to the audiobook for it this time, and it's so cool because there's narrators for each person. I love Six of Crows. It's a heist story. I do understand people who say it's slow at the beginning, but I think Leigh Bardugo does such a fantastic time setting up all these characters that when bad stuff does start happening to these characters, you're very connected to them. Whereas with some other books you read, I feel like you don't get attached to the characters enough that when bad stuff starts happening to them, you kind of are just a little indifferent. This book, I care so deeply about all these characters. I love everything. The Six of Crows duology is maybe my favorite series of all time. Like Harry Potter notwithstanding, obviously. But it's either this or the Raven Cycle. But I love this series so much. So that is everything I read in July. I had a very good reading month considering most of the books I read were 5 stars. But some of them were rereads, some of them are stuff I knew was going to be 5 stars. So very happy with my reading. If you guys want to stick around, I'm sure I'll have another video on this channel soon. I hope you enjoyed it. Alright,